Hello everyone and welcome to our latest Local History at Lunchtime talk. Today we have Jane Bower who will be talking about shopping at Hyde Park in the 60s. Now Jane has given talks for us before. She's a speaker and retired teacher and I'm sure this talk is going to be absolutely fascinating. So I will hand over to you now, Jane.
Thank you very much, Helen. Hello everybody. And thank you to Anthony Ram for inviting me in the first place and setting up this whole meeting. And for the photographs, I'd like to thank Abby Larter for taking all the contemporary ones, Claire Marlowe for sending me the earlier ones, and my father Len, and thanks to Josh too at Leodis and Richard at the Headingley Leeds websites, who very kindly allowed me to use photos from their collections free of charge. And finally, thanks to both Anthony and Karen at Leeds Central Library for supplying pages from Kelly's directories, and to Francis Byrne from Headingley Library for all his help and advice, and indeed to Helen for hosting this meeting. So, 6 underripe bananas. Hyde Park originated as the hamlet of Rangthorne, and the word Rangthorne is thought to have meant crooked hedge, and it was on the edge of Woodhouse Moor. The area nearest the moor seems to have been named Hyde Park Corner by a local farmer in honour of a visit to London early in the 19th century, and it was clearly intended to give a prestigious tone to the place. And Hyde Park, of course, still acts as a gateway to Headingley from the city centre. So let me take you back in time. It's 1960, I am 5 years old, and I live in flat 3 in Ashwood, the former villa of the poet laureate Alfred Austin at 48 Headingley Lane. So here's a picture of that in 1905. And you can see on the left, the nearest gate to us, that is the gate of Ashwood, where I lived. And a few steps further up would later appear the entrance to Ashwood Villas, which was to become my family's home for the next 55 years. So at this stage, 1960, I am an only child, and my parents, Len and Sadie Bower, both art teachers, have no car. So it's a frequent occurrence for me to walk down to Hyde Park with one or other of them to do the shopping. And I invite you to accompany us for a while. Leaving the large black gates of Ashwood, here's the scene in 1956 when I was almost 1 year old. Sadly, that isn't me running along the pavement there on the right, but it could easily have been. So we turn left and we walk towards Hyde Park, past Cumberland Road that you can see there, past Grosvenor Road, and several large old villas on our left. If I look down, I see my short white socks and round-toed sandals, and every paving stone was familiar. Some of them are still there. I could describe every shop we pass, but given the time limit, I will focus only on those where my memories are strongest. And the very first shops we come to are not really ones that interest a 5-year-old. So here are the first ones on our walk. Ashwell and Nesbitt, heating engineers, Spink and Simpson, Carlisle and Son, plumbers and electricians, are names I remember well, and some of which remained painted on there for decades. I think traces might even still be there. If Mummy needed to go to the Midland Bank, this was the next building along. It was set back at the corner of Regent Park Terrace, and I recall a quiet and gracious interior with tall, polished wood-panelled counters, which were above my head height. And this is that bank in 1937. Inside there was a wooden date calendar high on the wall, And I remember clerks stamping pieces of paper with handheld stamps. So crossing Regent Park Terrace, we would almost always enter the newsagents. And here's where the frustrations of memory and Kelly's directory begin. So here's the newsagents. Now, we always knew this well-used shop as Hilditch's, yet in all the Kelly's directories, it's named Spurs, and that's a name of which I have no memory at all. So here's the scene in 1949, the same shop. Inside, Hilditch's always struck me as rather haphazard, crowded and untidy. I remember cards on a revolving rack. Obviously, I remember the sweets of the time. I won't get sidetracked onto details of sherbet dips and Fry's Five Boys chocolate. I was a child who was very rarely given sweets. And I suppose there were piles of newspapers, though they wouldn't have interested me at the time. So we walk out of Hilditch's, and this is where the difference between shopping then and shopping now becomes apparent. So here we are, still in 1949, a little further on. And this next shop was Cole's. It was a furniture shop, double-fronted as it is now. And it was run by a pleasant, dark-haired man with black eyebrows, Mr. Cole, and his smiley, warm assistant, Joyce. Now, clearly buying furniture wouldn't be a regular occurrence in Hyde Park, but my father would always pop in just to say hello to Mr. Cole and Joyce. That's the way it was. He knew every shopkeeper by name. One incident I do remember is the day when Mr. Cole divulged to Dad, as I stood by, that he and Joyce were getting married. Now, my feeling is that their relationship had developed at the shop after she was appointed, but whatever the circumstances, what I remember is Dad saying to Mr. Cole, "You cheeky thing," and congratulating them. I'm a member of a Facebook page about old Leeds, and to my amazement, I found that one of the members is the daughter of the Coles, but very sadly, she has not been able to provide me with any old photos of them for this talk. Well, let's look at a scene in 1937. And next to Coles, we find Scars, as it was then, a good old-fashioned ironmonger's. And all I remember about this is the ironmonger's smell. Tin pails, scrubbing brushes, carbolic soap. And I do remember a sandy-haired man in one of those yellow ochre janitor's overalls. Well, this next scene is undated. And we round the corner and we come to the pub, which is that sort of mock Tudor building on the right there. A Hyde Park pub first appeared in the 1860s, and this present mock Tudor pub dates from the 1930s, when the local authority carried out road improvements at the junction. And this junction that we're looking at now originally marked the boundary between Leeds and Headingley. On reaching the pub, I always experienced a slight frisson of anxiety. Firstly, my parents were teetotalers, and although they had never, ever planted this idea in my mind, I always believed that public houses were dens of vice. I was quite frightened of the idea. Secondly, outside the pub would always be a newspaper seller, usually sitting in the little enclave. And these men were always truly worrying in appearance, reminiscent of Victorian workhouses, frightening to a small child. They were ragged, unkempt, and looking back, I think probably had mental health issues, learning difficulties, perhaps resulting from the war. They would never smile, and each had a distinctive and awful cry. One in particular I dreaded most, a rheumy-eyed, toothless old man who would emit one word at regular intervals. "Pow!" That's all he said. The word was post, but that's how it sounded. Dad always spoke cheerfully and respectfully to all of them, but I do wonder what their lives were like. I was astonished to find this next photograph, taken as late as 1973, showing a similar man in exactly the same spot. There he is, sort of sitting in that dejected pose in that same enclave. And here's the scene, a different view of it from the moor in 1966. Well, leaving my fears behind, we come to the little sweet shop, which you can just see bang in the middle of that photo there. And here's another one of it, which isn't dated, looks like perhaps 60s or 70s. We'd go past the pub on the left and come to this little sweet shop, which was run by two sisters who appeared to me then to be elderly, though of course they may not have been at all. This was a little black and white shop with Dickensian windows, but we rarely entered it, as A, we didn't buy sweets, and B, any we did buy would be purchased from hill ditches further up. So we've got a few views of this for you. This one is 1972, clearly something being demolished in the foreground, but there's the little sweet shop just to the left. This one is 1966, clearly in winter. And this next one is 1972. Where it's just to the left, it's in front of those masked by the little red brick buildings that you can see. Well, a little further on waste ground, which presumably had been cleared of its original similar buildings, was a shop we only visited on the occasional Saturday, and it was fascinating and continued to be so into my early adulthood. And here it is. This was Slingers Fish and Chip Shop, which was at least 90 years old when I knew it, and it clung on alone on the cleared area and had not altered much in all that time. You entered at the left and filed along the cracked, white tiled interior, giving your order at the counter. And the family order that I was sent to get, and the one I recall most, was 3 times and an extra fish, please. So I must be remembering the time after my brother had come along and was old enough to manage a fish of his own. And that's, of course, when I would be old enough to be allowed to go down there and get the fish and chips. So here's another view of it, again, undated, I'm afraid. So the women that ran this fish and chip shop were ginger-haired, a mother and a daughter. I think the mother was Mabel, and the daughter was certainly Elaine. Elaine was a large lady, I have to say, and I remember vividly the way she wrapped and salted and hurled vinegar onto the fish and chips from the bottle. When I was very tiny, I didn't like it when Elaine had her hair done, because it was be a very tight perm, and it appeared to be like a little sort of cake or hat of ginger curls sitting on the top of her head. And I remember the conversation behind the counter once, which indicated that our Elaine was preparing for her wedding. And I don't know what happened to any of them. It would be good to know. Well, back to a view in 1972 now. And treading back across the waste ground from the fish and chip shop, we cross the road and come to the furthest Hyde Park shop, which you can see directly in view there in the middle, which is Hyde Park Post Office, another fine Victorian building with beautiful arched windows. And this, like the bank, was a place of high wooden counters with cashiers sitting behind them. Very quiet always, apart from the stamping of things going on. And the cashiers were all seated down the left of the interior and also across the bottom. But I remember there were also counters to the right where customers could sort their stamps and sign their papers. And underneath them, there were metal semicircular bins screwed to the wall, dark brown and cut with little squares, with the word litter painted in cream on each one. Well, this is the scene in 2021, sadly misused and graffitied and pretty derelict, but still such a beautiful corner building. The counters, I remember, had pens on chains, and the cashiers had round, sinister-looking bowls containing what looked like yellow fungus or aging coral, but which in fact was decomposing sponge for moistening stamps. There's actually still one exactly like it in my local post office today. So let's step across that small cobbled alley that you can see. And that's where the road becomes known as the Crescent. And it's still the remaining jewel in Hyde Park's very well-worn crown. Built in 1906, it's an Edwardian row of shops with accommodation above. And so let's just move to the next shop over that little alley. This is Wakefords, seen here in 1972. I think this was previously Jackson's. Wakefords we visited often as it was a general provision and groceries store. You'd walk through that door where the lady's standing, and to the left was a long glass counter, behind which invariably stood Mr. Wakeford, a lady and another gentleman. I've never been sure which of the two men the lady was married to, but it was one of them. All were well-mannered, pleasant and cheery, and always wore white overalls, and the men almost always wore white hats. Moving to the next shop along that you can see there, we come to the sort that has vanished with time. And let's look at another scene of that. A draper's shop run by a single lady whose name I strained to remember, but I couldn't. Having obtained the relevant Kelly's directory pages from the Central Library, I had high hopes of finding the shop's name, but to my amazement, she wasn't listed. And it wasn't until I read the residential lists of who was living in the flats above that I found her. It amazes me now to realise how many lives were lived above these shops in interiors I never knew. The lady who ran this shop in my day was Miss Bessie Burns. And my memories of this shop are frustratingly vague. I would, of course, be very young. My mother was a superbly accomplished needlewoman. She was a lecturer at the then College of Housecraft, becoming the art teacher at Lawnswood High School later. She lectured in those days in textiles and dressmaking, and her dresses were so extraordinary that they're now in the Textile Museum housed at Leeds University. And so I'll just sidetrack to show you an example. This was one of the many dresses that she made for me, hand and machine stitching. These little mice were appliqued on. They had leather ears that lifted and little glass eyes fitted through. And all the embroidery that you can see there was done by hand. So she therefore knew what she was about in a draper's shop. That's it now, called Danham's. I don't know what it does or sells, but that's what it looks like today. Mum tended to get her fabrics and threads actually in Lewis's in town or Schofield's, but occasionally we would go inside Bessie Burns' shop. And in my mind, the shop front is shiny black with gold lettering, and inside is dark with a glass counter and those wonderful small polished drawers containing every imaginable item of haberdashery. Miss Burns herself I see as a small, neat figure, beautifully tailored in a grey, with a grey bun of hair. Now, whether this is true, I'll probably never know, but I do remember her as a smart lady, and Mum would always have a conversation with her. So next, a little further along from Bessie Burns was the Chemist, which according to Kelly's directory was called Moulds, though we never knew it as that. It was just the chemist shop. More beautiful glass frontages and 3 large coloured flasks of mysterious liquid in the window, which all chemists had in those days. Redmond's Grocers was the next, and then Walker's Butchers, but we tended not to use these often as we had alternatives. But to the right-hand side of one of these shops, there was a door, intriguingly leading up a curving staircase. In a scroll of sweeping lettering on the door was the legend S. Cor Ferrand. And I think this door that you can see with the arrows on it just behind the lamppost, I think that is the door where we used to enter. I think I may have skipped further on there. Let's go back to that one. There's the door. This was where we went to get our haircut. And again, I only have the vaguest memory of Mr. Ferrand himself, but I'm left with the impression of a showman or an impresario, rather with the mannerism of a ringmaster and perhaps with a small moustache. In those days, haircutting was a private business, and there were several booths with curtains which came down to your waist, like short shower cubicle curtains. And you went in, the curtain was drawn, and inside was a mirror, a basin and a chair, and a girl was assigned to you. Though I do remember Mr. Ferrand himself cutting my hair on at least one occasion and talking very amusingly to me. One of the girls was Mary, and although I liked her very much, I dreaded the moment when she plunged my head towards the white ceramic sink, when water from the rubber shower and stinging shampoo would run into my face and eyes. And I also found the huge domed hair dryers that fitted over your head very sinister, like some medical machine in a hospital. Further round the Crescent was Lascelles, which is just further to the right of the photo you're looking at now. Sadly, I can't find Lascelles listed at all in any Kelly's directory, amazing as it was there for years and years. This greengrocers and fishmongers was always very busy, and inside the glass door, to the right was a white marble slab, quite large, with wet fish displayed on it. While I loved eating plaice, especially the black side of the plaice with the pretty orange dots on it, I dreaded my mother buying the ghastly finnan haddock, which she would poach in loathsome milk, and I would have to fork the steaming, bright yellow, salt-laden fish into my reluctant mouth. The shop was full of artificial green grass, I remember. And it was here that I first met Greengrocer's apostrophe, in which Jeff Lascelles excelled. Apples with an apostrophe, oranges, bananas, they all had an apostrophe. And he drew the prices in one of those grocer's black pencils which he kept over his ear. He drew them on white plastic labels, blackening in the numbers on either side. Jeff was a very pleasant man, gingery haired with rather thick lensed glasses. And he had managed to find himself one of the most stunning wives on the planet. Margaret Lascelles was acknowledged by all to be truly striking. She was petite with a perfect dainty figure, peroxide blonde hair and film star looks. She mucked in behind the counter in her beautiful full makeup, always wearing rubber gloves on her immaculate manicured fingers. You didn't pick up your own stuff those days. You asked for it across the display. And Mum always asked for 6 underripe bananas, please. And that was the order that I was given when I was old enough to go shopping, hence the title of this talk. The Lascelles' son, Dean, who went to the same junior school as me, had inherited his dad's looks and red hair. But I remember being very envious of him because there were stairs mysteriously leading up to their flat over the shop, with a window hole cut so that you could look through them down to the shop. And I once saw Dean Lascelles looking through it, and I wished that I had the authority to do that. Out of Lascelles, further down the Crescent, and we come to the tiniest shop imaginable, barely the size of a telephone kiosk, more really of a triangle squeezed into the curve between 2 shops. And in those days, a man would stand in this minute space, selling newspapers, pens, and cigarettes. What he did all day and where he went to the loo remain a mystery, but he used to emerge from somewhere behind when you went up to the counter. And this sliver of a shop is, I believe, still there. And I think it might be just to the right of the picture there, the little left side of what was then Henry's. I may be wrong, memories are hazy, but it was a tiny, tiny space. And you can see there behind the lamppost, Harold Roberts Butchers, run by Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, who I can still see in my mind's eye in their white coats. Mr. Roberts had salt and pepper hair combed across his scalp, tortoise shell rimmed glasses, and a benign, pleasant manner. Like all shopkeepers, he counted the change into your hand after a purchase with a full explanation. That's 3 and 4, so 2pence makes 3 and 6, 6pence makes 4 shillings, and a shilling makes 5. I have 2 particular memories about this shop. First, there was a competition at my junior school. I went to Bennett Road, which is now the Heart Cafe. And the competition was to collect and mount halfpennies from, I think, 1900 to 1960 or something like that. I managed to collect almost all the dates and stuck them beautifully onto a hand-decorated card. I needed certain dates of halfpennies to complete my collection. And I remember Mum saying we could ask in the shops. We went to the butcher's, Harold Roberts, and Mum explained the situation to Mrs. Roberts. To my horror, Mum gave her a 2-shilling piece, and Mrs. Roberts quickly counted out 48 halfpennies into a plastic bag. I was dismayed. I thought we were going to ask Mrs. Roberts to scrutinise each halfpenny in the cash register for its date and only give me the ones I was missing. Well, it was a failure. I didn't manage to complete my collection. And worse still, a boy I disliked, who had mounted his coins with no imagination or finesse, carried off the prize for getting all of them. My second memory is going into the shop and waiting for Mum to make her purchases. Hanging by their feet from hooks were 2 dead hens, and I watched mesmerised as slowly watery drips of blood left their downturned beaks and fell to the sawdust below, matched by the tears which dripped from my eyes. I recall Mum and Mrs. Roberts exchanging a look, half smile, half grimace. I can never pass the beautiful mosaic floored entrance to that shop, which is still there, without thinking of those poor hens. Well, next along was Michelle's Bakery, which is blue here in the photograph taken in 2021. Michelle's Bakery obviously had a lovely smell. It was light and attractive inside, with the glass counter and display of cakes to the right as you went in. but it was run by a man who had a slightly snappy manner and was not a smiler. I once parked my little sister outside in her pushchair in the days when it was not thought unsafe to leave a child in a pushchair outside a shop. And she reached out and pulled off a piece of the loose plastic signage outside. Being an honest citizen, I went in and explained and apologised. Mr. Michel was not at all pleased, and I was always wary of him, particularly after that. But I don't remember any other bakers in the Crescent. Frank Palmer's motorcycles, which we never had any reason to visit at all, ended the Crescent, and you can see the very end of it on this picture to the extreme left, where there's a cafe nowadays. Clearly this is a view of the back of the Crescent, which I never remember seeing or visiting as a child, and this was where all those lives were led, presumably, where all those shopkeepers resided. Well, this is the view in 1972. Directly opposite, on the edge of Woodhouse Moor, was a small parade. Again, I can find no mention of it at all in the Kelly's pages, but I can find a fascinating view of the scene we're looking at there, taken in 1904. Now, this parade, if you walked along it, ended with Craven Dairies on the corner. And that was a shop about which I have 3 abiding memories. So let's have a look. It's now called Cicchini, but that was Craven Dairies in my day. You'll see a view of it earlier in a minute. So 3 memories. Well, first, I've always hated milk, as I indicated with the Finnan haddock memory. It used to make me gag when I had to drink it at school. And I would always give my bottle to another boy in the class. I still I'm not able to drink quantities of milk now. But I was waiting for my mother one day in Craven Dairies, and I stood transfixed as a young bus conductress in uniform stopped by for her morning break and downed from the bottle in one go a pint of full cream milk, and then nonchalantly left the shop. I was just stared at her, appalled, I remember. There we are, the very bottle, probably not the one she drank from. My second memory is years later when my school friend Fiona and I would call in and say, "Could we have 2 pork sandwiches with mustard, please?" These would be made before our eyes in soft, round rolls, and they were perfection. The third memory chills my blood, but I will share it. I went into Craven Dairies at the age of about 15. So this photo in 1973 would be exactly what it looked like at the time, on the right of the photograph there behind the Mini. Well, by this time I was slim with long hair, and as I entered Craven Dairies, leaning against the wall immediately inside the shop was Jimmy Savile. Now, he was then a famous DJ on Top of the Pops, quite well known in Leeds, which was his stamping ground. I'd always found him very physically unattractive, but I did think he was a nice, kind man. Totally starstruck, not knowing what to do at all, I stupidly said, "Oh, hello," and kissed him. "Did you see that?" he asked the amused staff. "Did you see that?" Well, I went home and said to my parents, "I've just kissed Jimmy Savile." And I have since thought of what might have happened. After Craven Dairies, coming back towards our house, there was another parade of shops, which was pulled down in 1968. Before these, though, I discovered something I never had realised existed. Just look at what we lost. So opposite Craven Dairies, there was another beautiful matching crescent. This is a photo taken in 1915. What amazes me is that I read that the reason this beautiful Victorian curving crescent was pulled down was to widen the road. Well, just look at the road there and think of it now. It's nowhere near as wide. So I really don't know why we lost that beautiful parade. Well, this lovely view was replaced with the parade I remember, which contained Timothy White's Chemist, which I recall because it had little glass animals on display, which I liked looking at, and a gentle girl assistant called Ruth, who was always there. And as I say, this was demolished, as this next slide in 1968 shows. This is taken by my dad. And round the corner of Victoria Road was Olive's Grocery. Let's look at that. So we're looking the other way now. Olive's Grocery is the shop just in from the right-hand side, where the man in white, a decorator, is kneeling with his ladder. So that was Olive's. We rarely went there because it would have meant crossing the road at a difficult point. And we shopped for our groceries at Wakefords anyway. But I do remember doing an errand for Mum at Olive's. I must have been pretty young. I went in, bought what she wanted, and then left the change from the purchases on the wooden windowsill outside the shop. Needless to say, it had vanished by the time I remembered and returned. On the extreme left there, you can see Mr. Green's sweet shop, exactly as I remember it, with rows of old-fashioned jars, and in, again, the dark interior, Mr. Green himself, a round-faced gentleman, from whom we occasionally bought sweets. Moving further up, another Mr. Green ran the carpet shop. Again, a shop one would rarely need, but we always said hello, and we must have gone inside because I remember vividly the smell of new carpets standing in vertical rolls. Next to his shop was Jean Crowther's flower shop, with its contrasting glorious smell, which ran for many, many years until Jean died of cancer and an era ended. And finally, the last shop on the parade, which you can just see directly under the church spire, it's got a barber's pole outside it. But in those days, this last shop was Mr. Kelly's greengrocery. And it had more artificial green grass. There's a view from the other side. I think this was taken in 1936, yes. But rather than the shop, it's Mr. Kelly himself that I remember. Like all other male shopkeepers, he had a pencil over his ear, his hair combed with brill cream across his balding crown, brown rimmed spectacles and a working coat. And like all the others, he knew me by name. But there were two distinctive things about Mr. Kelly. On leaving, he always gave me a banana, underripe or otherwise, and I never had the heart to tell him that I really disliked bananas. And Mr. Kelly also had a particular speech pattern, which decades later, my father remembered as clearly as I did. He would say thank you, and also use that lovely forgotten phrase, much in use by shopkeepers, much obliged, or much obliged to you. And he would use those many times during the transaction. But when you were ready to leave the shop, which is the graffitied one at the end here with the barber's pole, he would go into overdrive. Thank you very much, thank you. Thank you very much, thank you. Thank you very much, thank you. So I will end this nostalgic trip by saying the same to all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.